the blood trailing into the freezing woodshed belonged to the most dangerous man in the realm. Alex gripped his sword in the dark, waiting for the frail girl to scream. He was a hunted king, cornered and ready to strike to protect his final hiding place. But Chloe did not scream. She had never spoken a single word in her entire life. Instead of running from the black-soaked stranger, she dropped to her knees in the cold mud, raised her empty hands, and silently commanded him to yield. And to his own absolute shock, he obeyed. The cold wind swept through the valley of Oakhaven, carrying the scent of early winter. Chloe pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders as she walked toward the well. Silence had been her companion since the day she was born. While other girls sang during the autumn harvest, Chloe worked in quiet isolation. The villagers often ignored her, viewing her inability to speak as a bad omen. Yet, her hands possessed a language of their own. She could trace the shape of a bird in the air to describe freedom, or touch her heart to signal safety. That evening, the village square emptied quickly as the temperature dropped below freezing. Chloe carried the wooden bucket back to her cottage at the edge of the woods. Her home was a stone hut left behind by her parents. Inside, the open hearth provided the only warmth against the encroaching frost. She set the bucket down and leaned against the sturdy door. Her life was simple, filled with endless chores and lonely nights. She did not complain, for she had learned to find peace in her silent world. As she prepared to light the fire, a sharp sound echoed from the dark woodshed outside. Chloe froze, her fingers gripping the edge of the kitchen table. Outlaws often roamed the borderlands during the winter months, stealing food from vulnerable peasants. Fear gripped her chest, but she refused to hide in the corner. She grabbed an iron poker from the fireplace and stepped into the cold night. The moon cut through the bare branches, casting long shadows across the frozen ground. She walked slowly toward the woodshed, her boots crunching on the thin ice. A low groan escaped from behind a pile of oak logs. Chloe raised her iron poker, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pushed the wooden door open and peered into the darkness. A man lay collapsed on the dirt floor, his armor cracked and stained with dark blood. His face was pale, but his sharp eyes locked onto her with terrifying intensity. This was Alex, the sovereign ruler known across the realm for his unyielding power. An unexpected ambush by treacherous lords had forced him to flee his grand castle. He gripped the heartfelt sword, expecting the girl to scream and betray his hiding place. Chloe did not scream or run away. She looked at the deep wound on his shoulder, then lowered her weapon. Her eyes showed no malice, only the deep empathy of someone who understood pain. She knelt in the cold mud beside him, ignoring the threat of his sharp blade. With slow movements, she extended her hands to show she meant no harm. She pressed her palms together, then laid her cheek against them to signify safety and rest. Alex stared at her, his mind clouded by exhaustion and fever. He had commanded vast armies, yet he could not comprehend this silent peasant. She pointed toward the flickering warmth of her cottage door. Alex hesitated, but his bleeding body gave him no alternative. He allowed her to support his heavy frame as they struggled toward the hut. The brief journey drained the last of his strength, and he collapsed onto her small mattress. Chloe immediately went to work, fetching clean water and fresh linen. She cut away his ruined tunic with a kitchen knife. The wound was deep, caused by a jagged blade during the desperate ambush. She applied crushed herbs to the injury, causing his muscles to tense with sudden agony. Alex clenched his jaw, refusal to cry out in front of a stranger. She noticed his pain and gently touched his burning forehead with her cool palm. Then, she held up 2 fingers and moved them in a smooth, wavy motion. It was her personal sign for flowing water, a gesture meant to soothe his anger. Alex watched her slender fingers move with strange grace in the dim firelight. He did not know her name, nor did he understand her silent world. For the first time in his life, the powerful ruler was dependent on a peasant girl. Chloe brought a wooden bowl of warm broth to his cracked lips. He drank eagerly, the simple nourishment reviving his fading senses. As he rested his head back, his eyes followed her every movement around the room. She sat on a low stool near the hearth, mending his torn wool cloak. The silence between them did not feel heavy or awkward. It felt like a protective shield against the dangerous world outside her stone walls. Alex closed his eyes, listening to the steady crackle of the dry logs. He vowed to find his loyal guards and punish the traitors who stole his throne. But tonight, he was merely a wounded hunter, saved by a girl without a voice. Chloe looked at the sleeping warrior, wondering what storm had driven him to her doorstep. She knew his presence placed her life in grave danger. If his enemies tracked him to this valley, they would destroy everything in their path. Yet, she could not abandon a dying soul to the winter cold. She stood up and walked to the small window, peering into the black night. The forest remained quiet, but she knew the peace was temporary. She returned to her wooden stool, determined to keep watch until dawn. Her hands rested in her lap, waiting for the first light of morning. As the hours passed, Alex stirred restlessly on the bed, muttering incoherent words in his sleep. Chloe walked to his side and wiped the cold sweat from his brow with a damp cloth. He caught her wrist in a sudden, tight grip, his instincts reacting to her presence. His eyes flew open, filled with the wild fury of a hunted animal. Chloe did not pull away or show fear, despite the pain in her wrist. She looked into his eyes with calm reassurance, remaining perfectly still. Slowly, his grip loosened as he recognized her gentle face. He released her arm and sank back into the straw mattress with a weary sigh. Chloe made a small gesture, touching her chin and moving her hand downward. It was her sign for peace, a silent promise that he was safe under her roof. Alex nodded faintly, his defenses breaking down under her quiet kindness. He watched her return to the hearth to stir the dying embers. The warmth of the fire cast long, dancing shadows across her serene face. He realized he had never met anyone like this mute girl. In his court, words were used as weapons, filled with deception and flattery. Here, her silence carried more truth than any speech he had ever heard. The night deepened, and the frost painted intricate patterns on the glass pane. Chloe kept her vigil, her eyes darting to the door at every sound from the forest. She knew the risks, but her heart refused to give in to terror. Beside her, the powerful king slept, his fate now intertwined with her silent destiny. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through the frosted glass. Alex opened his eyes and stared at the rough wooden beams of the ceiling. His shoulder throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. He tried to sit up, but his muscles locked in protest. Chloe entered the room, carrying an armful of dry firewood. She saw his struggle and hurried to his side. She placed a firm hand on his uninjured shoulder, gently pushing him back against the mattress. Alex scowled at his own weakness. He had never needed help to rise from a bed before. Chloe shook her head and pointed a stern finger at his chest. She then pressed her palms together and rested her cheek on them, repeating the sign for sleep. He understood the command perfectly. She turned her back to him and began building the morning fire. Sparks flew upward as the dry bark caught the flame. Alex watched her move around the small space. Her clothes were thin and worn at the edges. She clearly possessed nothing of value, yet she had used her match linen to bandage his wounds. A rusty iron pot hung over the rising flames. Chloe tossed a handful of dried oats into the boiling water. It was a meager meal, barely enough to sustain one person, let alone two. She poured the thick gruel into 2 wooden bowls. She carried the larger portion to Alex and offered him a wooden spoon. He looked at the bowl and then at her. He pushed it back toward her, gesturing for her to eat first. Chloe smiled faintly, but refused. She tapped her chest, brought her hand to her mouth, and then waved it away. She was telling him she was not hungry. Alex knew it was a lie. He could hear the quiet rumble of her empty stomach. He took the bowl from her hands and divided the contents evenly into both dishes. He handed her back the second bowl and gave her a look that brooked no argument. Chloe hesitated before accepting the ode. They ate in silence as the ring rattled the loose window frames. A sudden knock echoed heavily against the front door. Alex immediately reached for his sword resting against the wall. Chloe held up a hand, urging him to stay hidden in the shadows. She walked to the door and pulled it open just a fraction. A burly man stood on the threshold, his breath plumy in the freezing air. He was the village miller, a man known for his cruel temper. He demanded the sack of grain Chloe owed him for the autumn milling. Chloe pointed to the empty corner of her hut, showing she had nothing left. The miller cursed loudly and pushed the door wider. He grabbed her wrist, threatening to take her winter coat as payment. Alex tightened his grip on his sword hilt. He prepared to lunge forward and sever the man's arm. Chloe did not panic or fight back against the brute. She simply reached into her pocket and produced a small silver coin. She pressed it into the miller's palm. It was clearly her last piece of money. The miller snatched the coin and walked away, muttering insults about her silence. Chloe closed the door and slid the heavy iron bolt into place. She leaned against the wood for a moment, her shoulders slumping. Alex watched her from the dim corner of the room. He felt a strange, cold fury building in his chest. Men had died for showing far less disrespect to him. Yet this woman endured the abuse without a single tear. She walked back to the hearth and picked up her empty bowl. Alex spoke for the first time since arriving. His voice was hoarse and grating from the cold. He asked her why she let the man treat her that way. Chloe looked at him in surprise. She set the bowl down and turned to face him fully. She tapped her lips with 2 fingers, then crossed her arms over her chest. Alex frowned, trying to decipher the meaning. He asked if it meant she could not fight back. Chloe shook her head and repeated the gesture slower. She touched her lips, showing her lack of voice, and then tapped her chest over her heart. She finally opened her hands outward. Alex stared at her hands, realizing the depth of her silent logic. She was saying that anger required energy she could not afford to waste. He leaned back against the wall, absorbing her silent wisdom. In his world, every insult was answered with immediate blood. Here, survival demanded a different kind of strength. He raised his own hand and clumsily mimicked her gesture. He tapped his lips and touched his chest. Chloe's eyes widened slightly in genuine surprise. No one had ever tried to learn her language before. A small, bright smile broke across her face. It transformed her features, wiping away the exhaustion of the morning. She nodded enthusiastically and pointed at him in approval. Alex felt a strange shift within his chest. He was a man who commanded legions and shattered enemy lines. Now, he found satisfaction in learning a simple hand sign from a peasant. The afternoon passed in quiet domesticity. Chloe tended to her chores while Alex rested and regained his strength. He practiced moving his injured arm, wincing as the torn muscles stretched. Chloe changed his bandages just before the sun began to set. The wound looked angry, but the bleeding had finally stopped. She applied a fresh layer of crushed herbs that smelled of pine and mint. Her touch was remarkably gentle, contrasting sharply with the harsh world outside. Dusk brought a new layer of bitter cold to the valley. It also brought the sound of heavy hooves striking the frozen earth. Alex heard the horses long before they reached the village square. He recognized the disciplined trot of military cavalry. These were not local outlaws or common thieves. They were his enemies, sent by the traitors to finish the job. Chloe heard the commotion and ran to the window. Torches flared in the distance, casting an orange glow over the snow. Armored men were kicking down doors and dragging villagers into the street. Alex forced himself up from the bed, ignoring the sharp pain in his shoulder. He grabbed his sword and prepared to make a final stand. He knew he could not defeat a dozen armored knights in his current state. But he refused to die hiding on a straw mattress. Chloe grabbed his arm and pulled him away from the door. Her eyes were wide with urgency, but her movements were precise and calculated. She dragged him toward the back of the cottage. A heavy woven rug covered the floorboards near the hearth. She kicked the rug aside to reveal a hidden wooden trapdoor. It was a root cellar, designed to keep vegetables from freezing during the harsh winters. She yanked the iron ring, pulling the heavy door open. A rush of damp, earthy air rose from the dark hole. She pointed down into the darkness and shoved him firmly toward the edge. Alex hesitated, hating the idea of retreating into a hole in the ground. Heavy footsteps crunched on the icy path, leading directly to Chloe's cottage. Voices shouted orders, demanding that every building be searched. Chloe pushed his uninjured shoulder again, her face pleading with him to trust her. Alex looked into her desperate eyes and yielded. He climbed down the narrow wooden ladder into the pitch-black cellar. The space was barely large enough for him to sit, with his knees pulled up. Chloe handed him his discarded armor and bloody tunic. She then closed the trapdoor above him. He heard the faint sound of the rug being dragged back into place. Total darkness consumed him. He sat in the freezing dirt, listening to the muffled sounds above. A loud crash echoed as someone kicked the front door open. Heavy boots stomped across the wooden floorboards. A harsh voice demanded to know if she had seen a wounded man. Alex held his breath, his hand gripping the cold steel of his sword. He knew Chloe could not answer their questions. He listened as the men tore the small cottage apart. Furniture splintered and clay pots shattered against the stone walls. A soldier cursed, complaining that the mute girl was useless. Footsteps approached the hearth, stopping directly above the hidden trapdoor. Alex closed his eyes, preparing to drive his blade upward through the wood. The soldier stood there for a long moment, the floorboards groaning under his weight. Then the man turned and walked away. The captain ordered his men out, deciding there was nothing of value in the hovel. The heavy door slammed shut, leaving the cottage in sudden silence. Alex waited in the dark, his heart pounding a steady rhythm. Minutes stretched into an eternity before he heard the trapdoor creak open. Light spilled into the cellar, revealing Chloe's face peering down at him. She looked pale and shaken, but her eyes held a fierce light. She reached down and offered him her hand. Alex took it, letting her help him climb out of the damp earth. He surveyed the wreckage of her home. Everything she owned had been destroyed or overturned. Yet, she did not look at the ruined furniture. She looked at him, checking to see if he was safe. Alex realized then that this silent girl possessed a courage his finest soldiers lacked. She had risked everything to shield a stranger from death. He made a silent vow in the ruins of her home. He would reclaim his throne, and when he did, he would tear the world apart to repay her. The cold wind poured freely through the shattered remnants of the front door. Alex stepped over the broken pottery and examined the splintered wood. He knew the soldiers would eventually realize they had missed a cottage and return with dogs. Staying in the ruined house meant freezing to death or facing the executioner's blade before dawn. He turned to Chloe and met her calm gaze. He told her they had to leave the valley immediately. Chloe did not cry over her destroyed home or hesitate at his command. She simply nodded and walked over to the corner of the room. She pulled a small canvas sack from beneath a pile of torn blankets. She packed 2 loaves of hard bread, a flint, and her thickest woolen shawl. Alex watched her gather her meager life into a single bag without a hint of sorrow. He strapped his heavy sword to his uninjured side and adjusted his leather belt. He stepped outside into the biting wind, scanning the dark tree line for any movement. The blizzard had started, covering the soldiers' tracks with a fresh layer of white snow. Chloe followed him out, pulling the wooden door shut behind her, even though it hung off its hinges. They walked away from the only home she had ever known without looking back. Alex led the way toward the dense pine forest, choosing the steepest path up the mountain. He knew of an abandoned watchtower near the summit that his enemies had forgotten long ago. The snow reached their knees, making every step a heavy burden. Chloe struggled to keep up with his long, determined strides. Her boots were thin, and the freezing moisture quickly soaked through the old leather. She wrapped her arms around her chest, fighting the violent shivers that racked her body. Alex started abruptly and looked back at her. He saw the pale blue tint of her lips and the frost clinging to her eyelashes. He realized he was pushing her far beyond the limits of her fragile strength. He walked back to her and reached out to take the canvas sack from her hands. Chloe shook her head and tightened her grip on the straps. She tapped her chest and pointed forward, insisting she could carry her own weight. Alex ignored her protest and easily pulled the bag from her frozen fingers. He slung it over his good shoulder, refusing to let her exhaust herself further. They continued climbing in silence as the temperature dropped steadily. The wind howled through the dark pines, masking the sound of their heavy breathing. After another hour of relentless walking, Chloe stumbled over a hidden root. She fell hard into the deep snow, scraping her palms against the icy crust. Alex was by her side instantly, dropping to one knee. He offered his hand, his eyes scanning her face for signs of injury. Chloe pushed herself up, brushing the snow from her skirt with trembling fingers. She noticed the dark red stains spreading across the bandage on his left shoulder. The sudden fall and the heavy lifting had torn his wound open again. Chloe forgot her own cold and immediately reached for her woolen shawl. She tried to untie it from her neck to wrap it around his bleeding arm. Alex caught her wrists before she could remove the fabric. He stared at her, completely bewildered by her instincts. She was freezing to death, yet her first thought was to give up her only warmth to save him. He pushed her hands down gently and shook his head. He unclasped his heavy fur-lined cloak with his right hand. He stepped closer and wrapped the massive, heavy garment completely around her small frame. The residual heat from his body immediately enveloped her in comfort. Chloe looked up at him in shock, her eyes wide beneath the shadow of his hood. She quickly raised her hands, trying to sign that he needed it more. Alex grabbed her hands again, holding them still against his chest. He told her that he survived worse winters on the battlefield, and she would wear the cloak. His voice left no room for argument, authoritative and absolute. Chloe lowered her hands, finally allowing herself to accept his protection. They resumed their trek, the heavy cloak dragging slightly in the snow behind her. Alex moved closer to her now, using his body to break the bitter wind. The storm worsened, blinding them with a thick wall of swirling white flakes. Just as Alex felt his own strength gain, the dark outline of a cave appeared in the cliffside. He guided Chloe inside, away from the punishing force of the blizzard. The cave was dry and smelled of old dust and mineral rocks. Alex dropped the canvas sack and immediately gathered a pile of dry twigs from the cavern floor. He used the flint to strike a spark, blowing gently until a small fire crackled to life. The warm glow illuminated the stone walls and pushed the shadows back. Chloe sat close to the flames, pulling his massive cloak tighter around her shoulders. Alex sat across from her, leaning his head back against the cold rock. He closed his eyes, his breathing heavy and uneven from the pain in his shoulder. Chloe watched him carefully, noting the pale sweat on his forehead despite the freezing air. She reached into the sack and pulled out a piece of the hard bread. She broke it into 2 pieces, moving to sit beside him instead of across the fire. She tapped his knee to get his attention. When he opened his eyes, she handed him the larger piece of bread. Alex took it without a word, staring at the small, calloused hand that offered it. They ate the dry bread in companionable silence, listening to the storm rage outside. When they finished, Chloe pointed to his bleeding shoulder. She made a tearing motion with her hands, asking for permission to check the wound. Alex nodded, sitting forward to let her inspect the damage. She carefully peeled back the damp linen, relieved to find the bleeding had slowed. She used a clean patch of her skirt to wipe away the dried blood. Her touch was incredibly light, offering a strange comfort that eased his tension. Alex watched her face in the firelight, mesmerized by her intense focus. He realized he wanted to know more than just her silent commands for sleep and food. He raised his hand and pointed to himself. He slowly pronounced his name, Alex, making sure she watched his lips. Chloe stopped her work and looked at him. She nodded to show she understood his name. Alex then pointed to her, raising his eyebrows in a silent question. Chloe smiled softly and placed her hand over her heart. She then traced a small, blooming flower in the air with her index finger. Alex repeated the gesture, tracing the imaginary flower clumsily. He asked if her name meant a flower. Chloe nodded and mouthed the word, shaping the syllables without sound. He watched her lips carefully, piecing together the name she was trying to share. He asked if her name was Chloe. Her eyes lit up with genuine joy, and she nodded vigorously. Alex felt a strange sense of victory at having spoken her name aloud. He promised himself that he would learn every word she held in her hands. Chloe finished adjusting his bandage and leaned back against the cave wall. Exhaustion finally overtook her, and her eyelids grew heavy. She rested her head against the stone, pulling her knees to her chest. Alex moved closer, sliding his uninjured arm around her back. He pulled her against his side, letting her rest her head on his chest instead of the hard rock. Chloe stiffened for a brief second before relaxing completely into his warmth. She closed her eyes, feeling safer than she had ever felt in her entire life. Alex rested his chin on the top of her head, staring into the dying fire. He had lost his kingdom, his army, and his throne in a single night of betrayal. Yet holding this silent girl in a freezing cave, he found a reason to endure it all. He knew the journey to the watchtower would be perilous. He knew his enemies would not stop hunting him until they saw his severed head. But anyone who tried to harm Chloe would have to face the full wrath of a king. He pulled his cloak tighter around her sleeping form, listening to her quiet, steady breathing. The storm raged outside, but inside the cave a new kind of power was quietly taking root. Sunlight pierced the cave entrance as the relentless winter storm finally broke. Waking before dawn, Alex found the fire had already burned down to cold ash. He shifted his weight carefully against the hard stone. Beside him, Chloe slept soundly under his heavy winter cloak. Her breathing was steady and calm in the freezing morning air. Alex did not wake her immediately, preferring to watch the quiet rise and fall of her chest. He realized he had never felt this kind of profound peace in his grand castle. Eventually, the biting cold forced them to begin the day's journey. Chloe opened her eyes and immediately offered him a bright, reassuring smile. She folded the heavy cloak and handed it back to him. Alex refused the garment with a firm shake of his head. He draped it over her shoulders once more and fastened the iron clasp at her neck. He told her they had a long climb ahead, and she needed the warmth. Chloe did not argue this time, simply tapping her chest and pointing to him in silent gratitude. They stepped out of the cave into a world buried beneath fresh white snow. The winter sun hung low in the gray sky, offering light but no real heat. Alex took the lead again, using his boots to carve a path through the deep drifts. He deliberately walked at a slower pace today, ensuring she never fell too far behind. Every few miles he stopped to check on her breathing and color. During these short breaks, he made a conscious effort to learn more of her silent language. He pointed to a snow-covered pine tree and waited for her instruction. Chloe raised her arms, spreading her fingers wide to mimic branches. Alex repeated the gesture, earning an approving nod from his silent companion. He then pointed to a hunting hawk circling high above the frozen valley. She linked her thumbs together and flapped her hands like steady wings. He mimicked the flying bird, feeling a strange satisfaction when she smiled at his awkward attempt. Their silent lessons made the agonizing trek feel far less brutal. Words were unnecessary between them now, replaced by a growing bond of mutual understanding. By midday, they reached a narrow ridge overlooking a steep gorge. Alex paused to examine a set of fresh tracks crossing their intended path. His combat instincts flared instantly as he recognized the heavy imprint of military boots. He held up a clenched fist, signaling Chloe to stop moving. She froze in her tracks, her eyes wide with immediate alert. 3 armed scouts stepped out from behind a cluster of dark boulders. They wore the familiar crest of the rebel lords who had stolen his throne. The lead scout drew his steel sword with a cruel laugh. He recognized the wounded king immediately and shouted orders to his men. They saw the deep bloodstain on Alex's shoulder and assumed he was an easy target. One of the younger soldiers noticed Chloe standing a few paces behind. The man smirked and lunged forward, intending to grab her as leverage. A dark fury erupted within Alex's chest at the sight of the soldier approaching her. He forgot his bleeding shoulder and the crushing exhaustion in his limbs. He drew his blade with lightning speed, stepping directly between the attacker and Chloe. The first clash of steel rang out sharply across the silent gorge. Alex parried the soldier's strike and countered with devastating force. His movements were a blur of lethal precision, honed by years of surviving the harshest battles. The young soldier fell backward into the snow, his weapon shattered by the impact. The remaining 2 scouts rushed forward, attempting to overwhelm him from both sides. Alex did not retreat a single step. He met their assault head-on, fighting with a terrifying, calculated aggression. He ducked under a wild swing and drove the pommel of his sword into the leader's jaw. The man collapsed instantly, unconscious before he hit the ground. The final scout panicked, dropping his shield and turning to run. Alex did not let the enemy escape to repeat their location. He closed the distance in 3 long strides and struck the man's legs from beneath him. The fight was over in less than a minute. Silence rushed back into the gorge, broken only by the sound of heavy breathing. Alex stood victorious among the fallen men, his sword lowered to his side. His chest heaved as adrenaline coursed through his exhausted veins. He looked down at his hands, realizing they were stained with fresh violence. A sudden wave of dread washed over him as he remembered who was watching. He slowly turned his head to look at Chloe. He fully expected to see horror and disgust written across her gentle face. He prepared himself for her to run away from the monster he had become. Chloe remained standing exactly where he had left her. She looked at the defeated soldiers, then shifted her gaze to his tense face. She did not flinch, scream, or back away in fear. Instead, she took a deliberate step forward, her boots crunching softly on the snow. Alex remained frozen as she closed the distance between them. She reached out and took his weapon hand, ignoring the grim reality of the battle. She used the clean edge of her woolen sleeve to wipe the sweat from his brow. Her touch was incredibly grounding, anchoring him back to the present moment. Alex looked into her eyes, searching for any hidden trace of terror. He asked her quietly if she was afraid of him now. Chloe shook her head with absolute certainty. She pointed to the fallen enemies, crossed her arms in an X, and shook her head again. She then placed her palm flat against his chest, right over his racing heart. She finished by tapping her own chest and smiling warmly. Alex understood the message with crystal clarity. She was telling him that she knew he fought only to protect her. The heavy armor around his heart cracked under the weight of her unconditional trust. He dropped his sword into the snow and pulled her into a sudden, desperate embrace. He buried his face in her soft hair, inhaling the faint scent of wood smoke and pine. Chloe wrapped her arms around his waist, holding him just as tightly. She rested her cheek against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. She did not need a voice to tell him that he was not alone anymore. Alex tightened his grip, silently vowing that he would burn the world down before letting anyone harm her. They stood together on the desolate ridge, wrapped in an unspoken promise. The danger was far from over, but the cold winter wind no longer felt quite so bitter. They left the fallen soldiers in the gorge without a backward glance. The winter sky bruised into a dark purple as daylight quickly faded over the mountains. Alex maintained a steady pace, forcing his boots through the knee-deep drifts. He tried to keep his posture straight, but the battle had taken a severe toll on his battered body. The adrenaline slowly drained from his veins, replaced by a deep, throbbing ache. His left shoulder burned continuously, the pain radiating down his spine with every step. He pressed his hand against the linen bandage and felt a damp warmth seeping through the fabric. The wound had reopened completely during the brief fight. He swallowed hard, ignoring the wave of dizziness that washed over his vision. Chloe walked closely beside him, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She noticed the unnatural pale color of his skin and the heavy sweat on his brow. The freezing air should have kept his face pale, but his cheeks were flushed with an unnatural heat. She tugged gently on his sleeve, gesturing for him to stop and rest. Alex shook his head stubbornly and pointed toward the distant mountain peak. He told her they could not afford to stop while the enemy patrols were still searching the lower woods. His voice lacked its usual commanding resonance, sounding rough and thin. They pushed forward into the rising darkness as the temperature plummeted again. The wind picked up, driving sharp needles of ice against their exposed skin. Alex stumbled over a hidden rock, his knees buckling under his heavy weight. He caught himself against the trunk of a dead pine tree, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Chloe rushed to his side and placed a hand on his chest. She could feel the erratic, hammering rhythm of his heart through his leather tunic. She touched his forehead and immediately pulled her hand back in alarm. His skin was burning with a severe, dangerous fever. Alex looked down at her, trying to force a reassuring smile that failed entirely. He opened his mouth to tell her he was fine, but a violent shiver wrecked his words. His vision blurred, the dark trees spinning wildly around him. He lost his grip on the rough bark and collapsed heavily into the deep snow. Chloe dropped to her knees instantly, grabbing his shoulders in a desperate panic. She shook him hard, but his eyes remained closed and unresponsive. The powerful man who had effortlessly defeated 3 armed soldiers was now completely helpless. Chloe knew he would freeze to death in minutes if she left him in the snow. She looked around the darkening forest, searching for any sign of shelter. A few hundred yards up the slope, she spotted the collapsed roof of an old hunting cabin. It was barely a ruin, but it offered 4 wooden walls to block the deadly wind. She grabbed Alex by the heavy leather straps of his armor and pulled. He was incredibly heavy, his dead weight anchored deep in the snowdrifts. She gritted her teeth, using every ounce of strength in her small frame. Her thin boots slipped on the ice, scraping her knees against hidden stones. She did not stop, refused to cry, and completely ignored her own physical pain. Inch by inch, she dragged him up the steep incline toward the ruined structure. Her lungs burned with the icy air, and her muscles screamed in protest. It took her nearly an hour to move him across the short distance. She finally pulled him through the broken doorway of the cabin and collapsed onto the dusty floorboards. The cabin was empty, smelling of damp wood and old leaves. Chloe forced herself back up, knowing the hardest part of the night was just beginning. She gathered dry debris from the corners of the room and struck her flint. A small fire soon crackled in the center of the floor, casting a dim, flickering light. She dragged Alex closer to the flames, unbuckling his heavy chest plate with trembling fingers. She pulled off his soaked tunic, revealing the angry, swollen wound on his shoulder. The edges of the cut were dark with infection, spreading a dangerous red heat across his skin. Chloe knew that simple water and rest would not save him this time. She grabbed her canvas sack and rushed back out into the freezing night. She remembered seeing a specific type of pale moss growing on the bark of the dead pine trees. Her father had taught her that this moss drew out poison when boiled into a thick paste. She scraped the frozen moss from the trees, ignoring the cold that numbed her fingers. She returned to the cabin and melted a handful of clean snow in her iron pot. She tossed the moss into the boiling water, stirring it until it formed a dark green poultice. Alex began to thrash on the floor, trapped in the grip of a violent fever dream. He muttered broken sentences about betrayal, blood, and falling kingdoms. Chloe knelt beside him, pressing a cool, damp cloth against his burning forehead. She applied the hot moss paste directly to his infected wound. Alex let out a sharp cry of agony, his body arching off the floorboards. Chloe leaned her entire weight across his chest to hold him still. She grabbed his right hand and squeezed it tightly, silently begging him to endure the pain. She traced circles on the back of his hand with her thumb, offering the only comfort she could. Slowly, the medicine began to take effect, and his violent thrashing subsided. He sank back into a deep, heavy sleep, his breathing evening out. Chloe did not leave his side for the rest of the long, dark night. She fed the small file with broken floorboards, keeping the bitter cold at bay. She washed his face with cool water and changed the poultice every few hours. Sometime before dawn, his fever finally broke, leaving his skin cool and pale. Chloe slumped against the wall, her exhaustion pulling her down into darkness. When Alex finally opened his eyes, the morning sun was streaming through the missing roof. He felt terribly weak, but the crushing weight of the fever was gone. He slowly turned his head and saw Chloe asleep on the floor next to him. Her clothes were stained with mud and his dried blood. Her hands were covered in fresh scratches from dragging him through the snow. He realized the immense physical toll this night had taken on her. She had fought the brutal wilderness and death itself to keep him breathing. He carefully reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair away from her face. His movement woke her, and her eyes snapped open in immediate alarm. She sat up quickly, her hands reaching out to check his forehead for heat. Alex caught her hand gently, bringing her bruised knuckles to his lips. He did not speak, letting the quiet gesture convey his profound gratitude. Chloe looked at him, her dark eyes filling with tears she refused to shed. She tapped her chest, moved her hand to her chin, and then pointed at him. It was a clumsy sentence, but he understood the desperate relief in her silent words. She was simply glad he was still alive. Alex sat up slowly, testing the strength in his healed shoulder. He looked at the ruined cabin and then back at the small, fierce girl sitting beside him. He knew that without her, the supreme king of the realm would have died an endless death in the snow. She was no longer just a peasant girl who had offered him a corner of her home. She was his savior, his protector, and the only light left in his fractured world. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her shoulder as she held him tight. The journey ahead was still long, but Alex knew he was no longer walking it alone. The fire burned down to a pile of white embers as morning stretched into a pale afternoon. Testing his weight against the cabin wall, Alex found his strength slowly returning. The deadly infection was gone, leaving only the dull, manageable ache of healing flesh. He turned to Chloe and signaled that it was time to move before the daylight failed them entirely. Packing the remaining bread, she tied the canvas stack with quick, efficient movements. The blizzard had completely passed, leaving a silent, glittering world in its wake. Stepping out of the ruins, they began the final brutal ascent toward the mountain peak. The air grew thinner with every step, making each breath a sharp sting in their lungs. Walking slightly ahead, Alex broke the hard crust of the snow to make her path easier. He no longer needed to look back constantly to know she was there. Through the howling wind, he could sense her quiet presence, steady and unyielding behind him. Hours bled into each other as they climbed higher into the treacherous, jagged rocks. The tree lines soon disappeared, replaced by sheer walls of dark gray stone and ice. Just before sunset, a massive shadow loomed abruptly through the freezing mist. It was Blackwood Keep, an ancient border fortress carved directly into the unforgiving cliffside. Tall iron gates blocked the narrow mountain pass, guarded by men wearing heavy black armor. A sentry pacing the high wall spotted them and shouted a harsh, echoing warning. 3 archers instantly drew their bows, aiming deadly steel-tipped arrows at the approaching figures. Alex did not slow his pace or raise his hands in a gesture of surrender. Pushing his hood back, he let the fading light fall across his scarred face. A single command tore from his throat, echoing off the stone walls with terrifying authority. The sentry froze instantly, dropping his bow over the wall in absolute disbelief. A frantic horn sounded from the watchtower, cutting sharply through the silence of the mountain. Grinding heavily against the frost, the massive iron gates tore the snow from the ground as they opened. A dozen armed men rushed out, led by a tall, battle-scarred commander named Marcus. Marcus threw himself to his knees in the deep snow, bowing his head without hesitation. The rest of the soldiers followed suit immediately, their armor clanking loudly against the frozen earth. Alex walked past the kneeling guards without offering a single word of greeting. Stopping only when he reached the center of the main courtyard, he turned to wait for Chloe. Intimidated by the imposing soldiers and the towering stone walls, she lingered near the gates. Never in her life had she seen a real fortress, nor witnessed proud warriors groveling in the mud. Extending his hand toward her, Alex patiently held his ground. He did not issue a verbal command or demand that she hurry her pace. Waiting in silence, he offered a quiet invitation for her to cross the threshold by his side. Taking a deep, trembling breath, Chloe stepped past the line of kneeling guards. She placed her small, scarred hand gently into his firm, calloused grip. Lacing his fingers through hers, Alex led her confidently toward the warmth of the inner keep. Marcus stood up quickly and hurried after them, his face pale with deep confusion. Stammering slightly, he asked his king what had happened to the royal escort and who the ragged girl was. Alex stopped walking and turned his head slowly to face his commander. His eyes were instantly colder and far more dangerous than the winter wind outside. Speaking in a low growl, he informed Marcus that his escort had been murdered by traitors in the capital. Pulling Chloe slightly closer to his side, he made his next words absolute. He declared that this woman had saved his life from the dirt, and she was to be treated as his equal. Marcus stared at Chloe, taking in her dirty skirt, bruised face, and fragile frame. Opening his mouth to ask a question, the commander closed it immediately when he saw the lethal warning in Alex's eyes. Alex demanded a warm room, a hot bath, and the best food the fortress had to offer. He then ordered Marcus to send for the keep's senior physician without delay. Bowing deeply, the commander rushed off to execute the royal orders. Guiding Chloe through the dark stone corridors, Alex ignored the stares of his men. Soldiers and servants stopped and bowed as they passed, their eyes wide with poorly hidden shock. No one dared to whisper a word, but the silent questions hung heavy in the damp air. Keeping her eyes on the stone floor, Chloe felt completely overwhelmed by the sudden shift in reality. Just 3 days ago, a village miller had violently threatened to strip the coat from her back. Now seasoned killers knelt at her feet simply because she held this man's hand. They finally reached a heavy oak door at the end of a heavily guarded hall. Pushing it open, Alex revealed a large chamber warmed by a roaring, crackling fireplace. Thick animal skins covered the stone floor, and a large feather bed sat in the center of the room. It was the commander's private quarters, quickly vacated and prepared for their arrival. Leading her to a padded wood chair near the fire, Alex pressed her down into the soft cushions. Ignoring the protest of his sore muscles, he knelt on the rug in front of her. He reached out slowly and began to unlace her frozen, ruined leather boots. Pulling her feet back quickly, Chloe shook her head in sheer panic. Touching her chest and waving her hands, she frantically signaled that it was inappropriate for a king to serve her. Capturing her wrists in midair, Alex held her hands firmly, but gently. Looking up at her, his hardened expression softened into something incredibly vulnerable. He quietly reminded her that she had cleaned his infected wounds when he was dying in a cellar. Titles and crowns meant absolutely nothing inside this room. Swallowing the thick lump forming in her throat, Chloe slowly relaxed her tense muscles. He carefully removed her wet boots and peeled away her freezing, threadbare socks. Her feet were painfully pale and covered in dark bruises from the brutal journey. Rubbing them gently with his warm hands, he helped the blood flow back into her numb toes. A timid knock echoed from the heavy oak door a few moments later. 2 female servants entered carrying large basins of steaming water, fresh towels, and clean silk garments. Keeping their heads bowed respectfully, they were terrified of making eye contact with the ruthless king. Standing up to his full height, Alex ordered them to help Chloe bathe and dress. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper as he issued a final warning. If they caused her even a moment of discomfort, he promised to throw them personally from the fortress wall. Trembling violently, the servants nodded quickly and rushed to prepare the bath. Before leaving the room to let them work, Alex turned back to face Chloe. Tapping his lips, crossing his arms over his chest, and pointing down at the floor, he signed to her. It was a clumsy combination of the gestures they had shared in the wilderness. Despite the rough execution, he was clearly telling her that she was finally safe here. Smiling brightly, Chloe let the tears she had held back for days spill down her cheeks. Wiping them away quickly with the back of her hand, she gave him a single, affirming nod. Closing the door quietly behind him, Alex left her in the warm, capable care of the servants. Walking down the torchlit hall to the war room, his demeanor shifted instantly back to cold stone. Marcus and 3 other captains were already waiting nervously around a large wooden table. A massive tactical map of the kingdom was spread out before them under the candlelight. Walking to the head of the table, Alex slammed his steel dagger violently into the center of the parchment. He demanded an immediate, detailed report on the rebel army's movements in the lower valleys. Clearing his throat nervously, Marcus stole a quick glance at the closed door down the hall. Cautiously, the commander asked if the mute girl was a prisoner of war or a political hostage. Pulling his dagger from the wood in a flash, Alex leveled the sharp tip directly at Marcus's throat. The busy war room fell into a deadly, suffocating silence. Lowering his voice to a dark, quiet rasp, Alex made his boundaries terrifyingly clear. He stated that Chloe was the sole reason they still had a king to follow into battle. Every man in the fortress was now ordered to defend her life before they defended his. Any disrespect shown to her, no matter how small, would be treated and punished as high treason. Swallowing hard against the sharp steel, Marcus nodded and stepped back carefully from the blade. Sheathing his weapon, Alex leaned his heavy hands on the edge of the wooden table. The winter storm had passed, but a much darker, bloodier war was just beginning. His enemies had tried to end his life in the freezing mud of the borderlands. They failed to realize they had merely forged him into something much sharper and far more dangerous. Now, he finally had someone worth burning the entire kingdom down to protect. Warm water washed away the grime of the wilderness, leaving Chloe feeling lighter than air. The servants moved with quiet efficiency, casting brief, terrified glances at the scars on her arms. They did not ask questions, silently washing the dried blood and bark from her pale skin. The heat of the bath eased the deep, lingering ache in her joints left by the brutal mountain climb. Chloe closed her eyes, letting the sudden comfort sink deep into her exhausted bones. She had never felt water this warm, nor touched cloth as soft as the thick linen towels they used to dry her. When they dressed her in a deep blue silk gown, the fine fabric fell smoothly over her fragile frame. The women braided her dark hair quickly, securing the long strands with a simple silver ribbon. They bowed deeply before leaving the room, retreating into the hallway like silent shadows. Chloe stood alone in the massive chamber, listening to the roaring fire crackle against the stone walls. A large wooden table in the corner of the room groaned under the weight of a royal feast. In Oakhaven, a single loaf of fresh bread was considered a rare and highly guarded luxury. Here, heavy silver plates were piled high with roasted pheasant, thick cuts of venison, and steaming root vegetables. The rich aroma filled the room, making her empty stomach twist with a sudden, painful hunger. Yet she remained frozen near the hearth, afraid to touch anything without explicit permission. The heavy oak door swung open, and Alex stepped into the room, locking it firmly behind him. He had washed away the dirt of the road, but his face remained tight with unspoken military tension. His heavy battle armor had been removed, replaced by a simple, dark tunic that emphasized his broad shoulders. He walked toward the table and pulled out a heavy carved chair, gesturing for her to approach. Waiting patiently, he did not take his own seat until she moved across the room and sat down. Alex watched carefully as she eyed the lavish feast with a mix of awe and deep hesitation. Chloe reached out timidly, taking a small, dry crust of plain bread instead of the rich meats. She nibbled the edge slowly, a deeply ingrained survival instinct telling her to ration her meager food. Alex felt a sharp, heavy ache in his chest as he witnessed this silent display of past trauma. He reached across the table and gently pulled the dry bread from her trembling fingers. Chloe looked up quickly, a flash of old panic crossing her dark eyes as she expected a reprimand. He ignored her fear and grabbed a silver plate, piling it high with roasted meat and thick gravy. Setting the heavy plate directly in front of her, he tapped his fingers against the wood to hold her attention. He pointed to the warm food, then to her, and finally made a sweeping gesture encompassing the entire room. He wanted her to understand that everything inside this fortress now belonged entirely to her. Chloe hesitated for a moment before picking up a heavy silver fork. She took a small bite of the warm meat, closing her eyes as the savory flavors overwhelmed her senses. A small, contented sigh escaped her lips, relaxing the tight line of her shoulders. Alex smiled faintly, picking up his own fork to eat alongside her in the quiet room. They shared the meal in comfortable silence, the crackling fire providing a soothing background rhythm. When she finally set her fork down, she looked completely satisfied and profoundly tired. Alex poured a cup of warm, spiced wine and pushed it across the table toward her hands. He watched her take a cautious sip, the dark liquid bringing a faint rush of color back to her pale cheeks. Leaning back in his chair, he raised his hands slowly to practice the signs she had taught him in the cave. He tapped his chest, touched his chin, and moved his hand down in the gesture for peace. He followed it by pointing to the stone walls and crossing his arms firmly over his chest. Chloe watched him intently, deciphering his clumsy but fiercely determined message. He was promising that this heavily guarded fortress would remain a safe haven for her. She smiled softly and repeated the gesture for peace, adding a new sign he had never seen. She pressed her hands together, intertwining her slender fingers tightly in front of her heart. Alex raised a dollop eyebrow, silently asking for the meaning behind the new motion. Chloe pointed to him, then to herself, and held up her intertwined fingers once again. She was telling him that they were tied together now, bound by the snow and their mutual survival. He felt the heavy weight of her statement settle deep within his bones. He nodded slowly, accepting her silent oath without a single moment of hesitation. A sudden, sharp knock interrupted their quiet communion. Marcus spoke loudly through the thick wood, apologizing for the intrusion but demanding an immediate audience. Alex stood up, his jaw tightening with instant irritation at the disruption. He walked to the door and opened it just enough to block the commander's view of the inner room. Marcus reported that their border scouts had located a large rebel encampment in the southern valley. The enemy forces were resting in the snow, unaware that the king had survived the initial ambush. Alex listened to the tactical report, his eyes narrowing with cold, calculating malice. He instructed Marcus to assemble the heavy cavalry in the lower courtyard before midnight. He planned to lead a preemptive strike, intending to crush the rebel vanguard before they could organize a siege. There would be no mercy, no prisoners taken, and absolute retribution delivered for the betrayal. Marcus saluted sharply, turning on his heel to execute the violent military orders. Alex closed the door and leaned his forehead against the heavy wood for a fraction of a second. He hated leaving her side so soon, but the survival of this keep depended on a swift, brutal offense. Turning around, he found Chloe standing near the fireplace, holding his heavy winged cloak. She had heard the harsh tone of his voice and understood the impending danger of the night. Walking over to him, she held out the thick fur garment without shedding a single tear. Alex took the cloak from her hands, his rough fingers brushing gently against her warm skin. He draped it over his shoulders and fastened the heavy iron clasp at his neck. Chloe reached up, straightening the collar of his tunic with meticulous, quiet care. She did not look afraid, nor did she try to stop him from riding into a bloody battle. She understood that a sovereign had to protect his borders with steel and decisive violence. She placed her palm flat against his chest, right over his beating heart. She tapped her own chest and pointed toward the heavy wooden door. Alex understood perfectly that she would wait for his safe return. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear. He promised her in a low, rough whisper that he would be back before the dawn broke. Stepping out of the warm room, he locked the heavy door securely behind him. He signaled 2 heavily armed guards to stand watch in the stone corridor. He commanded them to kill anyone who tried to enter the room without his explicit permission. The guards nodded firmly, gripping their heavy steel spears with strict military discipline. Alex strode down the dark hallway, his heavy boots echoing loudly in the silent keep. He entered the armory, where his loyal squires were waiting with his polished battle plates. Strapping on the dark steel, he felt the familiar heavy weight of war settle onto his broad shoulders. He walked out into the freezing courtyard, his breath pluming in the icy night air. Hundreds of armored men sat atop massive war horses, waiting in absolute silence for his command. Marcus rode forward, handing Alex the leather reins of a massive, pitch-black stallion. Swinging himself into the heavy saddle, Alex drew his longsword from its sheath. The sharp steel sang sharply in the darkness, reflecting the orange glow of the courtyard torches. He did not give a rousing speech or shout empty words of glory to his waiting soldiers. He simply pointed his lethal blade toward the southern valley. Spurring his horse forward, he led the dark tide of cavalry out of the fortress gates. The frozen ground trembled violently under the weight of the charging army. Back in the high stone tower, Chloe stood by the narrow glass window. She watched the long line of torches disappear into the treacherous mountain pass. She pressed her hand against the cold glass, a silent prayer echoing deeply in her heart. She knew the man riding at the front of that deadly column was a ruthless killer to the rest of the world. Yet, he was the only person who had ever treated her with true, unwavering gentleness. She walked back to the warm fire, sitting down in the heavy carved chair. She pulled her knees to her chest, listening to the bitter wind howling against the stone walls. For the first time in her lonely life, she finally had something precious to lose. The cavalry descended the mountain pass like a dark avalanche. Snow flew from pounding hooves as the horses charged into the lower valley. Alex gripped his leather reins tight, his eyes fixed on the distant glow of campfires. He felt the familiar rush of adrenaline mask the lingering pain in his shoulder. Rebel tents dotted the wide clearing, surrounded by a meager line of wooden barricades. The enemy soldiers slept soundly, believing the fierce winter storm offered them protection. They were gravely mistaken. Alex raised his long sword high above his head, letting the steel catch the moonlight. He swept the blade forward in a silent, deadly command. Hundreds of armored riders smashed through the wooden barricades without a single battle cry. Panic erupted instantly among the waking rebel forces. Tents collapsed under the weight of trampling war horses. Alex drove his mount straight into the heart of the enemy camp. His sword flashed in the darkness, turning away desperate strikes with effortless speed. He moved through the chaos with lethal precision, targeting the enemy officers first. No man could match his strength or predict his calculated strikes. Shadows consumed the traitors as the royal vanguard broke their disorganized lines. A rebel captain tried to rally his retreating men near the center of the camp. Alex spurred his horse forward, closing the distance in a matter of seconds. He swung his weapon with devastating force, shattering the captain's iron shield. The enemy fell backward into the snow, dropping his sword in sudden defeat. Alex did not pause to revel in the swift victory. He wheeled his horse around, searching the perimeter for any fleeing survivors. He had promised himself that no threat would ever reach the mountain fortress. He intended to keep that promise tonight. The skirmish ended almost as quickly as it had begun. Silence returned to the valley, broken only by the heavy breathing of the victorious horses. Marcus rode up to Alex, offering a crisp military salute. The commander reported that the rebel vanguard was entirely neutralized. Alex nodded slowly, wiping his steel blade on a fallen rebel banner. He ordered his men to secure the area and burn the remaining tents. He watched the flames rise into the dark sky, casting an orange glow over the snow. His kingdom was still fractured, but this valley now belonged firmly to him again. Turning his horse toward the steep mountain trail, he signaled the long ride home. Back in the high tower, Chloe paced the smooth stone floor. Sleep remained elusive, despite the soft mattress and the warm fire. She listened to the wind howling against the thick glass window. Her mind constantly replayed the image of Alex riding out into the freezing darkness. She walked over to the heavy wooden dresser in the corner of the room. A small wooden box sat near the edge, meant for the personal use of the commander. Chloe opened the lid and found steel needles, thick thread, and sharp iron shears. She looked across the room at the heavy armchair by the hearth. Alex had left his torn winter cloak draped over the wooden armrest. The dark wool was ripped along the bottom hem, damaged during their brutal climb. Chloe picked up the heavy garment and carried it to the small table near the fire. She sat down, threading a steel needle with steady, practiced hands. In her old village, mending torn clothes was a tedious, daily chore meant for survival. Tonight, the simple act of sewing felt like a profound, quiet duty. She smoothed the rough wool across her lap, aligning the torn edges perfectly. Her fingers moved with rhythmic grace, pushing the sharp needle through the thick fabric. She thought about how this very cloak had saved her life in the frozen wilderness. Alex had wrapped it around her shoulders without a second thought for his own comfort. She stitched the fabric tightly, ensuring the seam would hold against any future storm. The fire cracked softly, offering a comforting warmth against the bitter night outside. Hours passed as she worked diligently on the ruined hem. Her eyelids grew heavy, but she refused to abandon the task until it was finished. She tied off the final knot and snipped the thick thread with the iron shears. Smoothing her hand over the repaired seam, a small smile touched her lips. She folded the heavy cloak neatly, resting her head against the soft wool. Exhaustion finally overtook her anxious mind. She closed her eyes and drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep right at the wooden table. The first rays of morning light slowly crept over the jagged mountain peaks. Dawn painted the gray sky with pale streaks of pink and gold. Down in the main courtyard, the heavy iron gates groaned open. Chloe stirred slightly in her sleep, but did not wake. Alex rode into the fortress, his posture stiff from the long, freezing ride. He dismounted quickly, tossing his reins to a waiting stable boy. He ignored the cheering soldiers who gathered to celebrate the swift victory. Marcus tried to offer a formal battle report, but Alex waved it away with a sharp gesture. He wanted nothing more than to strip off his armor and see Chloe. He strode through the stone corridors, his heavy boots echoing in the quiet morning. He reached the heavy oak door and found the two guards standing exactly where he had left them. They saluted sharply, stepping aside to let him pass. Alex pushed the door open, expecting to find the bed empty and the room quiet. Instead, his eyes immediately fell on the small figure slumped over the wooden table. He stopped in his tracks, holding his breath to avoid waking her. He walked forward silently, his combat instincts fading into sudden tenderness. Chloe was fast asleep, her cheek resting against his folded winter cloak. He noticed the small wooden box of needles sitting open next to her hand. He looked closely at the dark wool, seeing the meticulous, even stitches along the hem. She had stayed awake all night to mend his ruined clothes. Alex felt a heavy, unfamiliar knot form tightly in his throat. He had spent his entire life surrounded by people who served him out of duty or fear. No one had ever offered him a simple act of care without expecting a royal reward. He reached out and gently brushed a dark curl away from her closed eyes. Her breathing was soft and rhythmic, completely at peace in his territory. He carefully slipped his arms under her knees and behind her back. He lifted her from the wooden chair with effortless grace. Chloe shifted slightly in his arms, turning her face into his chest. But she did not wake. He carried her across the room, his movements slow and deliberate. He laid her down gently on the center of the large feather bed. He pulled the thick fur blankets up to her chin, ensuring she was entirely warm. Alex stood by the edge of the bed for a long time, watching her sleep. The brutal violence of the night felt like a distant, fading memory. He realized that rebuilding his shattered kingdom was no longer his only purpose. He wanted to build a world where she would never have to be afraid again. Turning away from the bed, he finally began to unbuckle his cold armor. The war for the throne was far from over, but he had already won the only prize that mattered. Sunlight broke through the heavy gray clouds, illuminating the snow-covered training grounds of Blackwood Keep. Chloe opened her eyes slowly, the thick feather mattress offering a comfort she had never known. She blinked against the bright light, her mind struggling to place her unfamiliar surroundings. The memory of the dark tower room and her late-night sewing rushed back to her. She sat up quickly, pushing the heavy fur blankets aside. Alex sat in a wooden chair near the hearth, watching her with quiet intensity. He wore clean clothes, his dark hair damp from a recent wash. The mended winter coat rested neatly across his broad shoulders. He stood up and walked toward the edge of the bed. Chloe noticed the absence of tension in his jaw and the relaxed line of his shoulders. The dangerous, explosive energy that usually surrounded him was completely gone. He sat on the edge of the mattress, making the sturdy wooden frame creak under his weight. Reaching out, he tucked a loose curl behind her ear. He told her that the rebel vanguard was nothing but ash in the lower valley. Chloe let out a long breath, feeling a heavy weight lift from her chest. She raised her hands and signed a quick question, asking if he was hurt. Alex smiled faintly and shook his head. He assured her that no enemy blade had touched him during the night raid. He then took her hands in his large fingers dwarfing hers completely. His expression grew serious, his dark eyes locking onto hers. He promised that before the winter ended, they would ride through Oakhaven together. He swore that the village miller and anyone else who had ever caused her pain would face his immediate judgment. Chloe shook her head slowly, pulling her hands back just a fraction. She tapped her chest, moved her hand away in a sweeping motion, and pointed to the ground. She was telling him to let the past go, as she no longer cared about that wretched village. Alex watched her hands, understanding the profound grace in her silent request. He agreed quietly, though he privately vowed to ensure she was never disrespected again. A polite knock sounded at the heavy oak door. Alex stood up and gave permission for the servants to enter the room. 2 women walked in, carrying a large wooden trunk between them. They set it down near the fireplace and opened the heavy brass latches. Inside rested a magnificent gown made of heavy black velvet and silver silk. It was tailored perfectly to match the dark, imposing colors of his royal crest. Alex turned to Chloe and gestured for her to rise. He told her that the army was gathering in the main courtyard below. He wanted her to stand by his side when he addressed his men. Chloe felt a sudden spike of anxiety at the thought of facing thousands of soldiers. She looked at her own scarred hands and then at the lavish velvet dress. She felt entirely unworthy of such grand garments or such a prominent place. Alex stepped closer, bridging the gap between them. He tilted her chin up gently, forcing her to meet his unwavering gaze. He told her that she was the only reason he had breath in his lungs today. He insisted that the entire kingdom needed to see the woman who had faved their sovereign. His voice left no room for doubt or hesitation. Chloe took a deep breath, drawing courage from his absolute certainty. She nodded once, accepting the terrifying honor he was offering. Alex left the room to let the servants help her dress for the occasion. The women worked quickly, lacing the black velvet tight against her waist. They draped a heavy silver chain over her shoulders, letting the fine metal catch the firelight. When they finished, Chloe looked into the tall glass mirror standing in the corner. The ragged, mute orphan from the borderlands was gone. In her place stood a striking, resilient woman wrapped in the colors of a king. She walked out into the stone hallway where Alex was waiting for her. He wore his formal battle armor, the dark steel polished to a mirror shine. When he saw her, he stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. He offered his arm, his eyes reflecting a deep, fierce pride. Chloe slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow. They walked together down the long, winding staircases of the ancient keep. Guards snapped to attention as they passed, their armor clattering in perfect unison. The heavy wooden doors of the main balcony swung open. A wave of freezing air hit Chloe's face as she stepped out into the light. Below them, the massive courtyard was packed tightly with thousands of armed men. Banners flapped wildly in the cold wind, bearing the black and silver crest of the royal house. The sheer volume of the assembled army was breathtaking and terrifying. Marcus stood at the front of the ranks, holding his helmet under his arm. When Alex stepped up to the stone railing, a deafening cheer erupted from the soldiers. Swords beat against iron shields, creating a thunderous rhythm that shook the fortress walls. Alex raised his right hand, and the massive army fell into absolute silence instantly. He did not shout or pace the length of the balcony. He stood perfectly still, projecting a lethal, commanding authority over his forces. He announced that they would march on the capital before the next moon. He promised to crush the traitors who had poisoned the court and stolen their lands. The men roared their approval, ready to follow him into the fires of hell. Alex raised his hand again, silencing the courtyard for a second time. He turned away from his army and faced Chloe. The soldiers watched in quiet confusion as their ruthless king gave his full attention to the fragile girl. Alex reached inside his heavy steel breastplate. He pulled out a heavy obsidian amulet attached to a thick silver chain. It was the royal seal, the ultimate symbol of sovereign authority in the realm. He stepped close to Chloe and lowered the chain carefully over her head. The cold obsidian rested heavy and secure against her chest. He then took a step back, ensuring every soldier in the courtyard could see his next movement. He did not speak a single word aloud. Instead, he raised his hands, lifting them high so his gestures were visible to the thousands below. He pointed to his own chest, then crossed his arms in the sign for a shield. He moved his hands outward, creating the sign for absolute protection. He pointed to Chloe, then pressed his right fist hard against his heart. He knelt slowly, lowering his massive frame until his knee struck the stone floor of the balcony. A collective gasp echoed across the vast courtyard. No one had ever seen the unyielding king kneel before another living soul. Alex continued to move his hands, executing the signs she had taught him with careful precision. He touched his chin, moving his hand down to promise peace. He intertwined his fingers tightly, repeating the silent oath she had made the night before. He was telling her and the entire world that they were bound together forever. He finished by laying his sword flat on the ground at her feet. He looked up at her from the stone floor, his dark eyes filled with absolute devotion. He was giving her his life, his blade, and his entire kingdom. Chloe stood frozen, tears spilling hot and fast down her pale cheeks. She looked at the deadly weapon at her feet, then at the powerful man kneeling before her. She looked down at the massive Arnie waiting in the snow. Following their king's silent command, Marcus drew his sword and dropped to one knee. Behind him, thousands of soldiers moved in perfect synchronization. The sound of iron hitting the frozen earth echoed like a falling mountain. The entire military might of the kingdom knelt in the snow, bowing their heads to the silent girl. They did not demand a speech, nor did they question her lack of voice. They accepted her as their sovereign because their king demanded nothing less. Chloe wiped the tears from her face with the back of her silver sleeve. She did not shrink away or hide behind Alex's imposing shadow. She stepped forward, picking up the heavy steel sword from the stone floor. It was far too heavy for her to wield, but she held it firmly with both hands. She offered Hilda back to Alex, refusing to let him surrender his strength. As he stood up to accept the weapon, she raised her free hand. She pressed her palm flat against his armored chest, right over his heart. She tapped her own chest, then pointed to the distant snow-covered mountains. She was telling him she would stand beside him no matter how far the war took them. Alex smiled, slipping his arm securely around her waist. He pulled her against his side, presenting a united front to the cheering soldiers below. The wind whipped around them, tearing at the banners and tossing the fresh snow into the air. The fragile, silent orphan was gone forever. In her place stood a queen, protected by the most dangerous man in the world. And as the army prepared to march, the enemies of the crown had no idea what kind of storm was coming for them. This story always reminds me that true power isn't about holding a sword. It's about having the quiet courage to be kind, even when the world is freezing cold. I'd love to hear which moment of their journey touched you the most. Leave a comment below and let me know. If you enjoy these quiet little escapes, please subscribe and stay a while. I'll see you in the next story.